remember, we're all volunteers. Just to tell you a little bit about what we're going to do tonight. The purpose of this meeting is, just as the invitation says, empowering you, the citizen. I think that we have really gotten away in our nation from believing that we are sovereign as citizens. And we tend to think that all is well, that all we need to do is send somebody to Congress, go to the polls every 2 years, and that they'll take care of us. So we need to have a little change of thought. And so what we're going to be doing tonight is we're going to be empowering you, and we're going to ask you to give us a report card afterwards if you would please. This would help us further. First, we're going to be teaching about America's beginnings and our founding documents and principles of self-government found therein and in the UCRP platform. Or if you don't know what that is, the Utah County Republican Party platform, which I have given you here. What is a party platform? What's the value of having a platform?
What we stand for.
Pardon me?
What we stand for.
It's what we stand for. It's important that we have platforms, that we have foundations. And so this is a statement of those things that we value, and how we think, and how we consider ourselves, and how we consider our government. It defines us. So what we're covering tonight is the preamble. You can read along if you like. We, the members of the Utah County Republican Party, do hereby affirm our belief in that it was through his intervention that this nation was established. The foundation of our platform is the knowledge that all people are created equal, and that the role of government should be limited to protecting and preserving the God-given rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the ownership and control of property. And in order to identify our party and our elected officials with certain shared values and principles, we do hereby present this platform to convention delegates that was first, of course, done at the convention, and the public, and invite all who share these values and principles to vote for Republican candidates. So that's what we're going to be doing first. I would like to introduce David Gowdy. He has been teaching a group of citizens in my house, and it's just been amazing, the things that I have learned and the inspiration that I received from him. And so first of all, we're going to listen to David. He founded the Washington, Jefferson, and Madison Institute in Virginia in 2004, and he teaches there part-time. The Institute provides continuing education courses to high schools and middle school government and history teachers on the principle of the Constitution and the lives and writings of the Founding Fathers. He is the author of 7 Principles of Liberty, and back on his table, he has kindly and generously offered those to us. And Thomas Jefferson and James Madison's Guide to Understanding and Teaching the Constitution. I didn't know there was such a thing. This is wonderful. They, Jefferson and Madison, gave us a guide for teaching the Constitution. So I'm going to turn the time right now over to David.
It's for me to be here with you, and as Jackie mentioned, as citizens of the Republic, you do hold, in my opinion, the highest office in the Republic, citizen, the ones with the power. And that power, as we know, is delegated to government. So it's a great privilege to be here with you. As Jackie mentioned, I founded the Institute that she described. It's kind of a long name, the Washington, Jefferson, and Madison Institute in Virginia in 2004. And since 2007, I've been traveling back there twice a year to teach continuing education classes to, as she mentioned, high school and middle school teachers for about a 9-county area around Charlottesville or Albemarle County. Charlottesville, as you may know, St. Bend and Monticello, Jefferson's home and estate. is located there. My wife and I fell in love with Virginia. We actually lived there for a year and a half, and it's our goal to move back to Virginia. But anyway, as Jackie mentioned, my objective here tonight is to share a few observations from these classes that I teach on the Constitution, not just to teachers, but here in Utah and also in Charlottesville to citizen groups just like yourself, and to share a few things from this guide that I've been sharing with others that I discovered. So, just to give you a little bit of background, I did go to law school, and I don't know if that's an advantage or disadvantage. As one Supreme Court justice said, that studying Supreme Court opinions doesn't necessarily help you learn the Constitution. And even though I went to a fine law school just down the highway here, I didn't feel really that I had learned the Constitution. And one of my professors was Rex Lee. Now, don't get me wrong, I learned some good fundamental things about the Constitution. But in 1995, following some thoughts I had and impressions, I started studying the lives and writings of the Founding Fathers. Now, when I say the lives, I purposely decided not to study any biographies. Now, there's some great biographies out there. If you ask me, I'll tell you I really like John Adams by David McCullough, and I like Alexander Hamilton by Ron Chernow. There's some other great biographies, but I particularly decided not to study biographies. I don't want to read what historians said about the founders or what they gleaned from studying their writings. I wanted to study the writings myself. And so beginning in 1995, I started reading the writings of the Founding Fathers. And I went to Barnes & Noble. This is 1995, 1996. I started buying books. And anyway, long story short, I accumulated a little library of books that are the writings of Thomas Jefferson, the writings of George Washington, etc. In the writings of Thomas Jefferson, I came across a passage early in 1996 that fascinated me. It struck me as being very significant, and Jackie kind of touched on it. The last great objective of Thomas Jefferson's life was to found the University of Virginia. Those of you who've been to Monticello and have seen his gravestone, he mentions that he was the author of the Declaration of Independence, the author of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, and the father of the University of Virginia. He doesn't even mention that he was President of the United States, let alone the first Secretary of State. And so this was the great passion, last passion of his life, was to found this university. And it took quite a few years to get the legislature there in Virginia to approve it, to establish a campus, and begin to build buildings, which was ground broken in 1819. Well, in March of 1825, Jefferson was then the rector of the University of Virginia, meaning like the head trustee. And on the board of visitors with him, trustees as we would call them today, was James Madison. So here we have Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, and we have James Madison, known as father of the Constitution, on the board of the visitors of the University of Virginia on March 4th, 1825, in his writings and reports that they met and adopted a resolution. They did not set forth specifically how any subject should be taught at the University of Virginia other than the Constitution. And they specifically said, this is how we want the Constitution taught at the University of Virginia. And in that resolution, I found the sources of what I believe are the principles of the Constitution. So again, you study Supreme Court opinions, which is what the Supreme Court says about the Constitution. But their approach was, not very many Supreme Court opinions, to study probably by 1825. But they said, here are the sources of the genuine principles of the Constitution. And with respect to the Constitution itself, they said there are three primary sources. The first one is the Declaration of Independence itself. And we might think, oh, well, that makes sense. They go hand in hand. But it's a source for the principles of the Constitution. And I'll make another comment on that here in just a little bit. Secondly, the Federalist Papers. Now, probably if I ask for raising hands, everybody's either has the Federalist Papers, have heard of the Federalist Papers, or how many of you have read the whole Federalist Papers? A few? Okay. So this was me in 1995. I hadn't read all the Federalist Papers. I probably read a few excerpts. But I got all the Federalist Papers. You get it in paperback, you can get it at your local bookstore, you can order it on Amazon, you're going to spend $7 or $8.
You can get them here.
You get it free online. There you go. Get it on your smartphone and download it on your whatever, Kindle or whatever you have. So I have one there too. So Federalist Papers for free. You don't have to spend. So get the Federalist Papers. I started reading the Federalist Papers, and I read, and it took some time. I got up early in the morning, and so I'm going to rise a little bit earlier. I started reading the Federalist Papers. As I read the Federalist Papers, it was like the light went on in a dark room. I mean, I thought I understood something about the Constitution, but until I read the Federalist Papers, I can tell you, I did not understand the Constitution. Now, this is my personal experience. I don't know about you, but I would encourage you to pay the price to read the Federalist Papers. And once you do, I think you'll go, oh, I really see more clearly now what the Constitution was designed to do and what it's all about. And since we're in kind of a political setting here, once you do, I think you would think, as I do think, that every elected representative should read the Federalist Papers. I think it's a travesty if a representative of the United States has not read the Federalist Papers. I don't know how they would think that they could legislate under the Constitution if they hadn't. So that's my personal opinion. And finally, they said, so the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers, finally, Washington's farewell address. And Jacki, what I did bring was Washington's farewell address. I didn't bring my 7 Principles of Liberty. I brought Washington's Principles of Liberty. So the farewell address is what's back on the table. They're free. Take as many as you'd like. Take a few for yourself and your family. The farewell address, they said, contained principles or maxims of American liberty. And many of you, I think, maybe some of you are nodding your heads, understand the farewell address. So how significant is the farewell address with respect to the Constitution? Some years ago, I traveled to Boston, and being a lawyer, I thought, well, I had a little spare time. I'm going to go over to Harvard, to the law school, and just visit it. Well, that would be something that would be fun to do. I walked into the library at Harvard University Law School, and in the law library, there's a statue of Joseph Story. Who's Joseph Story? Joseph Story was the first great constitutional scholar. And he wrote an exposition on the Constitution that was published in around 1850. So he published what he thought would be a manual for students in what you might call high school then or college to study the Constitution. And in his manual on the Constitution, the first appendix, if I recall correctly, but in the appendices is the farewell address. Okay, so in his mind, the farewell address went with the study of the Constitution. And that's, of course, what Washington Jefferson said. If you want to understand the Constitution, understand the principles of the Constitution. So we meet here in a building, and you're going to go home to a home. And some of you work in office towers. And whether you're in this building or in your home or your office tower, those buildings are constructed according to principles. There's a foundation, there's walls, there's ceilings, but inside of all of that, there are specific ways in which the foundation is laid and poured. There are specific ways in which the walls are constructed, and there are the manner in which we add the HVAC systems and everything, and how do people that construct buildings know how to build that? They have blueprints. Now, we appreciate the outward building itself, and yet, if we want to alter the building, or we want to understand really the building, or do anything with that, to put an addition on it, or make some modification, we would get out what? The blueprints. And may I suggest that these documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers, and Washington's farewell address, are the blueprints of the Constitution. If we want to understand it, if we want to understand what it was designed to do, if we want to know what its structure, its meaning is, we need to go to these documents. Otherwise, just by looking at the four corners, we may appreciate it just like we do this building, but we will not be equipped with the knowledge and the power to alter it, modify it, or change anything to do with it, or to understand its true application. So that, I may suggest that is an analogy. So I just want to make a couple observations on some of these documents and some things that Jefferson and Washington and Madison said. So first, just briefly, I want to make an observation about education, and I want to make an observation about our union, and finally I want to make an observation about religious liberty. So first, education. So again, what was in Jefferson's mind and Madison's mind? It was that we needed to educate the people. Madison said this. He said, a popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power which knowledge gives. So knowledge gives us power. If we want to understand the Constitution so that we can defend it and preserve it, we must obtain that knowledge. Okay? Jefferson himself felt that the purpose of education in a republic is to, quote, form statesmen, legislator, and judges on whom public prosperity and individual happiness are so much to depend, to expound the principles and structures of government, and a sound spirit of legislation, which shall leave us free to do whatever does not violate the equal rights of another. And finally, to develop the reasoning faculties of our youth, enlarge their minds, cultivate their morals, and instill into them precepts of virtue and order. I'll come back to virtue in just a little bit. So, with these thoughts in mind, this is why he established University of Virginia, and specifically said, this is how I want, he said with Madison, this is how we want the Constitution taught. So I recommend that to you. Okay, an observation on unity. A few months ago, I was traveling to Virginia, and I met a lobbyist. He works for the natural gas industry, and he's been working in Washington, he said, for over 20 years, lobbying senators and congressmen on behalf of the natural gas industry. And I thought it was very interesting. He lives in Virginia, and we had a nice conversation. But he made an observation that I can share with you. He said, in the over 20 years in which I have served as a lobbyist to the U.S. Congress, he said, I have never seen this level of partisanship that we're experiencing now. He said, there's always been the left and the right, but he said there was always middle ground, and they've seen that they could find it, and that we could chart a course based on the middle ground. He said the middle has disappeared. That's his opinion. But it made me reflect on the Union, and on unity of government, and on some things that Washington said in the farewell address. So let me just read a couple quotes from Washington on the Union. First, he prefaces and says, we should all think of ourselves as Americans first. Not Irish Americans, African Americans, Mexican Americans, or whatever. He said, we should think of ourselves first as Americans. He said, the name of American, which belongs to us in a national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than in any appellation or appeal derived from any local discrimination. No matter what your heritage, we should be Americans first. We should, in my opinion, we should put something hyphenated before it. Now, we can use that in various situations, but we should think of ourselves first as Americans. So that lays the foundation for his next quote. The unity of government, which constitutes you one people, is also now dear to you. Is justly so, for it is the main pillar in the edifice of your real independence. The support of your tranquility at home, your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, of that very liberty which you so highly prize. Now, we know what it's like to be united in a family, or on a team, or in Boy Scouts, in your patrol, or whatever it may be. But when we're united, we can accomplish more and we have more power. But when we are divided, a house divided, as Lincoln said, against itself must fall. So we are here as Republicans, and it's good to have parties, I think. They've existed a long time, but there's a danger with parties. What does Washington say is the danger? He says, the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, is itself a frightful despotism. So the spirit of party itself can lead to a despotism. It says the absolute power of an individual or a party eventually elevates themselves on the ruins of public liberty. That's a warning in the farewell address. So it's good to be in a party, but we should be careful, I think, about partisanship. We should look for the good on both sides of the aisle, as they say, and we should look for that common ground in which we can chart a course to preserve the Union. And who is better to describe that than Abraham Lincoln? He faced the great crisis of the Civil War, in which our Union was challenged to a degree that it never has been before. Nation divided, states seceding from the Union. And what did he want to do? He said he felt his mission was to preserve the Union. That was his first and foremost mission. Now eventually, under the hand of divine providence, he recognized that it was also to abolish slavery. But what did he say about the Union? He said, and he was reflecting, by the way, on a Bible passage, and he didn't write this in a letter, he didn't share it with anybody else, it was just a personal meditation on Scripture. He read Proverbs 25:11, which says, "A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in pictures of silver." And you may have heard this quote before, but I'd like to read it. "The prosperity of the United States," he wrote, this is Abraham Lincoln, "is not the result of accident. It has a philosophic cause. Without the Constitution and the Union, we could not have attained the result. But even these are not the primary cause of our great prosperity. There is something back of these, entwining itself more closely about the human heart. That something is the principle of liberty to all. The principle that clears the path for all, gives hope to all, and by consequence enterprise and industry to all." And then he says, "The expression of that principle in our Declaration of Independence was most happy and fortunate. Without this, as well as with it, we could have declared our independence of Great Britain, but without it, we could not, I think, have secured our free government and consequent prosperity. The assertion of that principle, the principle of liberty at that time, and equality, was the word fitly spoken as proven to be an apple of gold to us." So he says the principles of the Declaration of equality, of the rights of man, and of liberty to all is the apple of gold. And he said the Union and the Constitution are the picture of silver subsequently framed around it. The picture was made not to conceal or destroy the apple, but to adorn and preserve it. The picture was made for the apple, not the apple for the picture. So let me just restate that. The Constitution and the Union was made not to conceal or destroy the Declaration, but to adorn and preserve it. The Constitution and the Union was made for the Declaration, not the Declaration for the Constitution. If we ever lose sight of the principles of the Declaration of Independence, we lose the apple of gold. And we will have an empty frame and a picture of silver that could even be used as an instrument of oppression. Okay, final observation. Religious liberty. In Madison's Federalist 51, which those of you who are familiar with Federalist Papers will know that's one of the significant ones, right? About separation of powers and checks and balances. He makes this observation. He says, "In a free government, the security for civil rights must be the same as for religious rights." I'm going to read that one more time. "In a free government, the security for civil rights must be the same as that for religious rights." Civil liberty and religious liberty go hand in hand. You cannot have one in perpetuity without the other. There is no way we would have civil rights without our religious liberties. It was a religious people that came and founded this land. And if we lose our religious liberty, I promise you, we will lose our civil liberty. You cannot maintain one without the other. So, religious liberty, just to conclude, what's an observation I'd like to make? Well, in my studies and teaching one of the classes back in Virginia to high school teachers, I found this very interesting article. It was published in the Virginia Historical, make sure I quote this right, the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography. And the title of the article was "Pursuing Happiness in Colonial Virginia." And that caught my attention. I don't know about you, but I like to pursue happiness. I really believe in that one right particularly. I really like it. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, obviously, happiness means different things to different people. But what was being preached in Virginia during the colonial period of time prior to the Revolution? An interesting subject. And this author, Jacob Blosser, researched and found what were Anglican and other preachers preaching in Virginia in the mid-1700s and in this 1774, 1775 period. Well, it was part of the first phase of the Great Awakening, and we've heard about that. It went on into the 1800s, and other things resulted from that Great Awakening. But during that time in Virginia, the preachers relied primarily on the teachings of a Tillotson. Tillotson was the Archbishop of the Anglican Church in the 1600s, and he published his sermons. And in his sermons, Tillotson stated this, just one quote: "Virtue and goodness are so essential to happiness that where these are not, there is no capacity of it." In other words, without virtue, you cannot have happiness. Okay? So, Jefferson's parish in Albemarle County had Charles Clay. He was the Anglican minister who preached at his mother's funeral when his mother died. Okay? And Charles Clay taught this: give all diligence to grow in grace and increase in virtue, which brings true happiness. So, isn't it interesting that when we read the writings of Jefferson and Washington, we might read something like this. This is what Jefferson recorded: happiness is the aim of life. Virtue is the foundation of happiness. And Washington, in his farewell address, says, "'Tis substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. The rule indeed extends with more or less force to every species of free government. Who that is a sincere friend to it can look with indifference upon attempts to shake the foundation of the fabric." In other words, the fabric of free government, of popular government, of self-government is virtue or morality, says Washington. And then he says, "Can it be that Providence has not connected the permanent felicity or happiness of a nation with its virtue?" So preaching in Virginia, virtue leads to happiness, reflected in the writings of the Founding Fathers. And of course, we may be familiar with the quote that John Adams said, that our Constitution was made only for a moral and a religious people. So virtue is the foundation of the Republic. So in summary, as citizens, we need to educate ourselves. We need to obtain the knowledge that brings the power to enable us to govern ourselves in this nation and to influence those around us. Secondly, I think we need to take a big step back and reflect upon how do we build our union. Let us look for what is good in America and embrace that America the Beautiful that we have seen, and look for the good on both sides of the aisle and seek to find unity in our citizenship. And finally, religious liberty. Without religious liberty, we shall have no civil liberty in the long run. And the source of religious liberty are the principles of virtue that are the foundation of a republic. Thank you so much.
This brings us to the proper role of citizens, and David has introduced this pretty well. Individual responsibility and accountability are necessary for government to offer within the limited powers granted by the divinely inspired Constitution of the United States of America, in keeping with the principles established by our founding fathers. We believe a society can only remain free when the majority of its members lead spiritually grounded and morally upright lives, and are willing to become involved to preserve these values. They support the rule of law and believe in upholding the law of the land. We're going to now listen to Stephen Wright. Steve is a writer, producer, composer, and he has completed 3 documentaries on American history: The American Birthright and George Washington's America's Authentic Superhero, parts 1 and 2. He's the president of Aspire Productions, and he's involved in speaking and holding events centered on educating people more about the complete history of the founding of our nations and correct constitutional principles. And I'm very happy to have him here today, and he has brought me a surprise, and that's his son. And I think that he's going to introduce his son. He's going to split the time with his son, because his son represents our youth. And I don't see a whole lot of youth here tonight, but we will eventually die out, and we need our youth. So I'm going to turn the time over to
Jacki.
besides here, doing a lot more fun things than being here. You know why I'm taking this? You know why I put the watch up here? To you know what it means when you see a politician come up and put his watch on the counter, on the platform? Not a dog on it there. But it looks good. I'm actually going to introduce my son, and he's going to take about 10 minutes, and he's going to share some ideas that this has been a project of his that he began a number of years ago, some things that he delved into and found, and he brought this message to me and shared it with me, and I thought it was pretty enlightening, pretty impressive. Understanding who we are is understanding our history. If we want to know who we are as Americans, and we want to know where we're going, we have to know where we've come from. And if we don't know where we've come from, we don't know who we are, and we don't know where we're going, and we have no measures. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But Nick's going to talk a little bit about where we've been, and where we've come from, and where we're going. And so I will turn that way. I'm glad to be able to come and speak to you guys today and share some of the things that I've uncovered and that I believe in. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to present all the material I have, so it's a little bit lacking. Please bear with me. Only here in America were the common folk of the old world given a chance to show what they could do on their own, without a master to push or order them about. History contrived an earth-shattering joke when it lifted by the nape of the neck lowly peasants, shopkeepers, laborers, paupers, jailbirds, and drunks from the midst of Europe, dumped them on a vast continent and said, "Go to it, it's yours." Well, give us kind of a measure of the results of such a thing. We can see how well things are for us today. And in the 1840s, it says, looking back, abundant data exists from states like Connecticut and Massachusetts to show that by 1840, the incidence of complex literacy in the United States was between 93 and 100%, wherever such a thing mattered. According to the Connecticut census of 1840, only one citizen out of every 579 was illiterate, and you probably don't want to know, not really, what people in those days considered literate. It's too embarrassing. Popular novels of the period give a clue. Last of the Mohicans, published in 1826, sold so well that a contemporary equivalent would have to now move 10 million copies to match it. If you pick up an uncut version, you find yourself in a dense thicket of philosophy, history, culture, manners, politics, geography, analysis of human motives and actions, all conveyed in data-rich periodic sentences so formidable, only a determined and well-educated reader can handle it nowadays. Yet in 1818, we were a small farm nation without colleges or universities to speak of. Could those simple folk have had more complex minds of their own? As I think about this, I think about a quote from Plutarch that says, "A mind is a fire to be kindled, not a vessel to be filled." And I would remind you that Lincoln had 50 weeks of formal education. Benjamin Franklin's education ended at 10 years old, or formal education. And Washington had 2 years of formal education. I've read from a number of sources that in the early 1800s, 80% of the United States population worked on a farm. Congress had not yet been given the power to impose taxes. Presidents had hostile views to the political power of the National Bank, which was the predecessor to the IRS. Families worked the farm together. The father didn't leave the home to go work somewhere else. They were united in supporting themselves. Children were expected to bear adult responsibilities from a very young age and contribute. They were taught principles of self-reliance and self-government, which were the dominant political views of the time. In July of 1755, at the age of 23, possessing no university degrees, the alumnus of no military academy, with only 2 years of formal schooling under his belt, half-orphan George Washington was detailed an officer in the Virginia militia to accompany an English military expedition, moving to take the French fort at the forts of the Monongaw and Allegheny, the point that became Pittsburgh. His general, Edward Braddock, was an aristocrat commanding a well-equipped and disciplined force considerably superior to any possible resistance. Braddock felt so confident of success, he dismissed the advice of Washington to put aside traditional ways of European combat in the New World, On July 9, 1755, 2 decades and 1 year before our revolution, commenced under the direction of the same Washington, Braddock executed a brilliant textbook crossing of the Monongahela near the present Homestead High Bridge by Kennywood Amusement Park. With fife and drum firing in martial spirit, he led the largest force in British colonial America, all in red coats and polished metal, across the Green River into trees on the farther bank. Engineers went ahead to cut a road for men and cannon. Suddenly, the advance guard was enveloped in smoke. It fell back in panic. The main body moved up to relieve, but the groups meeting going in opposite directions caused pandemonium. On both sides of the milling redcoats, woods crackled with hostile gunfire. No enemy could be seen, but soldiers were caught between waves of bullets fanning both flanks. Men dropped in bunches. Bleeding bodies formed hills of screaming flesh, accelerating the panic. Entered George Washington, almost unknown to American schoolchildren. Making his way to Braddock, he asked permission to engage the enemy wilderness fashion. Permission denied. Military theory held that allowing commands to emanate from inferiors was a precedent more dangerous than bullets. The British were too well trained to fight out of formation, too superbly schooled to adapt to the changing demands of the new situation. When my grandfather took me to the scene of the battle, years after, on the way to Kennywood, he muttered without explanation, "Bums couldn't think for themselves." Now I understand what it meant. The greatest military defeat the British ever suffered in North America before Saratoga was underway. Washington's horse was shot from under him, his coat ripped by bullets. Leaping onto a second horse, his hat was lifted from his head by gunfire, and the second horse went down. A legend was in the making on the Monongahela that day, passed to Britain, France, and the colonies by survivors of the battle. Mortally wounded, Braddock released his command. Washington led the retreat on his hands and knees, crawling through the twilight, dragging the dying Braddock, symbolic of the imminent death of British rule in America. John Taylor Gatto, The Underground History of American Education. The introduction of mandatory public schooling was something that didn't happen until the late 1800s. The author of the famous 1870 Act, W.E. Foster, explained that the intention of introducing fee-based government-run establishments for the first time was not to replace the vast system of private schools, but to simply fill the gaps. Now, if that doesn't sound like our Obamacare, I don't know what does, where they could be found. His officials, however, were over-ambitious in their reports of the needs. And after government schools were erected, they were often found to have much surplus capacity. To reduce their embarrassment over half-empty schools, the education boards then resorted to lowering tuition fees and using tax revenues to fill the breach. The lower price naturally expanded the demand, but this was at the expense of the private schools, many of which could not survive such unfair competition. After education was made compulsory by statute, the government school advocates argued that it was wrong to compel the very poorest to do something they could not afford. But rather than propose a special financial dispensation or grants to these families, the advocates insisted that education should be made free for all, the rich and the middle class as well as the lower income groups. Free education was legislated for the new government schools exclusively because it was argued that it would be inviting conflict to ask taxpayers to subsidize religious schools. Protestant taxpayers, for instance, would object to their taxes financing Catholics, and vice versa. In this way, the new gap-filling government schools were given a wide-open field with their zero-priced education. Since most of the subsequent growing population naturally chose the free alternative, the private school share of the market declined and that of government schools skyrocketed. The Spread of Education Before Compulsion, Britain and America in the 19th Century by Edward West. After this happened, childhood was extended by 4 years. Industrialization was also played a major role in this. Child labor laws were introduced, and school began to focus on the ideas that of concentration on centralized economy and a strong political state and what it needs. During this time, ideas about education began to emerge. We want one class of person to have a liberal education. We want another class of person, a very, very much larger class of necessity, to forego the privilege of a liberal education and fit themselves to perform specific, difficult manual tasks. That was Woodrow Wilson. Education began to be seen as a potential tool to classify the way individuals are to act, think, or feel. as the result of some unit of instruction. Using the methods of behavioral psychology, children will learn proper thoughts, feelings, and actions, and have their improper attitudes brought from home remediated. In all stages of school manipulation, testing would be essential to locate the child's changing mind on an official rating scale. Bloom's taxonomy of education. Education planners saw a future with the impersonal manipulation through school of future America, in which few will be able to maintain control over their opinions. The Behavioral Teacher Education Project. Now I have some questions to ask. Were these people successful in their attempts to use the education system as a tool for public control? Which is a preferable course for today's children? Planned schooling aimed at teaching students the characteristics desirable to an employer, such as being highly trained at specific tasks and becoming successful by gaining the favor of superiors. Or teaching children to love learning, to be confident in their ability to think critically, even if it means challenging a superior and sticking by their principles even under pressure. Our history has shown that a free people left to their own devices with nothing but their personal drive for success, comfort, and the love of God produces an educated population, a powerful economy, less poverty, an abundance of wealth, and unmatched charity. Why then do we seek to plan the future of our children? Why have we implemented so many devices for control? Why do we seek to fill our children's minds with what government, businesses, and banking systems think beneficial with devastating results? Our children are spoiled, lack self-discipline, are distracted by novelty, borrow themselves into bondage, demand government benefits, and are almost entirely illiterate and unaware of their nation's true history, much less their responsibility as citizens of the last stronghold of freedom in the world. I present to you the idea that self-driven, self-taught, homegrown common sense is the answer to today's problems, that we are suffering from excessive schooling, entitlement, and regulation, and we have largely turned our backs on the lessons of the past. Now, I'd like to finish by giving you a quote from Ezra Taft Benjamin, who served as the Secretary of Agriculture. From the very beginning of recorded political thought, man has realized the importance of education as a tremendous potential for both good and evil. In a free and open society such as ours, a well-rounded education is an essential for the preservation of freedom against the chicanery and demagoguery of aspiring tyrants who would have us ignorantly vote ourselves into bondage. As the educational system falls into the hands of the in-power political faction or into the hands of an obscure but tightly knit group of professional social reformers, it is used not to educate, but to indoctrinate. Ezra Taft Benjamin, An Enemy of Darkness. Thank you.
His grasp of the Founding Fathers' era, his knowledge and ability to weave together all of those tidbits. Is it Alan out there who offered our prayer?
Yes.
I appreciate that prayer. It spoke directly to some points I would like to try to make tonight, and I'm just going to try to make a few points tonight. I had a couple of pages of stuff prepared. Thank you. So I had a couple of pages of stuff prepared, and I'm going to go off of these and talk about a couple of things that I feel I ought to talk about tonight, and I'm going to tell you a couple of short stories. We talked a bit, Jacki talked about accountability, responsibility. Those are pretty relative terms. I'd like to try to bring some focus a little bit on those tonight, but I want to add another idea to the ideas of responsibility and accountability. I also want to bring the idea of adaptability into this equation, and I want to oppose accountability against adaptability. What I believe our nation and most nations begin to do is run through a predictable human cycle, and it repeats itself depending upon the education and knowledge of its people every so many generations. And what begins to happen is we prosper, and we become disrespectful of the things upon which our prosperity was generated. We forget the principles of our foundation because we get too busy having a good time and enjoying the prosperity. And a society begins to indulge itself. And through those indulgements, it begins to corrupt itself, and it begins to walk away from the foundations that made that society profitable and successful in the first place. If you read the Bible, if you read LDS scripture, if you look at any religious story, you begin to see this cycle repeat itself in humanity. That cycle is, I believe, responsibility versus adaptability. And so what do people do when they're faced with a changing society? They have the choice of saying, I'm going to make a choice. Something's happening. I see it in my society and I don't like it, so what am I going to do about it? Now, adaptability is a pretty important virtue to acquire because adaptability is critical in life to survive. Because often we don't find circumstances every day that are what we're looking for, what we're hoping to find, and so we have to be somewhat adaptable. The danger of adaptability is when it becomes the catalyst or the answer when we face changes we shouldn't be altering or giving into. And unfortunately, that is what a society begins to do. It begins to face a challenge, and rather than using accountability and saying, I believe in something here, I stand for something here, our culture stands for something here, I cannot accept this change in society, I must speak against it, I must challenge it, I must not just stand back and let it take place. But too many people allow adaptability to take place. They adjust. One of the examples of this, I will give you briefly, was in the Pilgrim Fathers who came to this nation. Before they came to the nation, they went to Holland, and they tried to make the civilization in Holland work. And in Holland, life was pretty tough. And I'm not going to have the time to go into the details of all that happened there, but their youth had to go to work to help support the families because they couldn't make enough money to survive. And William Bradford said it was as if our children were withering in the very bud. Before the bud could even bloom, they were withering. And they realized the life in Holland just was not working out. They were losing their children into the Dutch culture. They had to look for another alternative. They decided not to adapt. They decided to be accountable to something. And that accountability drove them to make another journey, a tremendous journey to a hostile wilderness, to take risks beyond what many of us have ever seen in our lives and can understand. And when they came to this nation, they went through that difficult time. Half the group died as they got here in that first winter. But they understood that there was going to be a price to be paid, and this did not shake their faith because they knew they could not walk away from everything that they stood for and everything they had fought and lived for. And so they went forward, they healed these relationships, and they created a colony which endured, and they left a legacy to this nation that started a movement to this nation of certain groups of people that determined the course this nation took. Now, had that group adapted, and in fact, there were many other separatist groups that left and went to places like Holland and Europe. This was not the only separatist group that separated and tried to find another life. Those other groups that went to Holland and did not leave and went to Denmark and other places, within 10 years they had assimilated into the populations and they were forgotten. We don't even know who they are anymore. But we know other groups left because they chose to adapt. Now today in this nation, we face an opportunity. We are in one of these cycles, and our culture, again, is suggesting that we adapt, we change, we accept, we be kind, we be fair, we be decent. These are lovely terms, but they're all subjective terms. And unfortunately, what comes with those terms is a whole new mindset about what America ought to be, what it ought to be turned into, what it ought to be created. That is what concerns me. I want to talk about a couple of things from the Republican platform, which I admire and respect. It's a wonderful platform. Strong families, small government, low taxes, fiscal responsibility, a nation under God, natural rights. Those are the founding principles of America, and they're in our platform. Are we supporting those today? Are we being accountable to those, or are we adapting those to a new terminology, a new way of looking at things? Patrick Henry, I spoke just a minute ago about history, having a reference. I listen to these blogs today. I watch a political question be raised, a legitimate political question. I see someone try to defend the founders and the principle of liberty, and I watch the vitriol and the hatred and what seems to be such clever, witty satire by people who go and attack these men. And I'm amazed, and I think, why are they doing this? Because they have no frame of reference. They have no idea who these men are. They've never been taught about them. Because in our school systems today, what have our school systems done? Have our school systems been accountable, or have they adapted? Where is the teachings of the Founding Fathers? Where is divine providence? Where are the strong families? Where is the small government? Where are the low taxes? Where is the fiscal responsibility? Where is the nation under God? Where are the natural rights? Are they taught in the schools today? They have adapted. If the Republican Party is going to follow this prayer that was given, if we are going to save our troubled nation, we will not do it by adapting and following other avenues that people are taking today that are leading this nation down a calculated path to a determined result. If you want to know where America's headed today, all you need to do is read the story of the Founding Fathers. It's all there. We know where we will be in a few years from now if we do not become accountable. These men and what they've shared with you, this powerful information that they've attempted to put into your hands tonight, is the foundation on which we could go forward and we could save this nation. I want to tell you two stories. I want to tell you a quote first. Patrick Henry. What a wonderful man. Most of us know of some of those comments that he made early in the history. I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know of no way to judge the future, but by the past. Patrick Henry understood where our nation was going as the British began to exert its authority over the people, as it began to change their charters, as it began to take control of the colonies, putting its crown-appointed governors in place of the colony governors, putting judges in place of the colony judges. The king was getting everything ready to take control of the people's lives. He was putting all the building blocks he needed into place so that he could give the people no recourse. There'd be nowhere they could go to get out of whatever he wanted to do to them, and the founders saw this happening. What is our government doing to us today? I don't need to go through all of the avenues that they are going about today to lock up and take control of all of the means that provide our existence today. They are getting control of all of it. Private enterprise is being squashed. The independent businessman is being swallowed up. Corporations are being absorbed. The banking industry is being taken over. The car companies are gone. Our banking institutions are being infiltrated and pulled in. Our power companies are run. How long will we go without electricity if they decide they need to turn it off on us to get our compliance? The Second Amendment rights are under threat. It's one of the last things that communism does when it takes away the guns from citizens so they can't resist and they can enter its free education camps. And then you take the last members of the populace who know anything about freedom, who could reinvigorate these principles, and they are systematically eliminated. Don't think that any of this is arbitrary or accidental. The Republican Party has an opportunity. I know of no way to judge the future but by the past. If we don't know the past, we don't know where we're going. Why are our youth so easily manipulated? Why do they cheer for Obama? Because they don't know who he is, because they have no frame of reference. Whose fault is that? I'm afraid to say it's ours, because we have not taught our children. And you know what? Your parents probably didn't teach you, and they weren't taught. There is no vehicle today in America to prepare us for government. There is no vehicle today in America to prepare us for self-government. That's not an accident either. If you study history, you realize you're being manipulated and controlled and nicely moved along in a certain direction because they are recreating America and they're refashioning it for a new future. Is it any wonder that We are in so much debt, and that debt mounts. It goes higher and higher, and they can't seem to come to any compromises. They can't seem to turn it around. They can't seem to come together and cut anything out of the budgets. If you want to destroy a nation, destroy it financially. It can't come back. And then you deliver it over. And then when you've told it, you had your shot. You had your shot at freedom. We tried to make it work. Couldn't work. It's your fault. We're going to have to deliver you into some new system now because your Constitution just didn't work. It failed. We haven't lived under our Constitution for 100 years. It did work, and if you study history, you'll know it worked. And if you study history, you'll begin to see when it was being replaced and who replaced it, and at what point we began to lose these precious freedoms. Why did the Founding Fathers take this incredible, impossible course that they took? Did they really think they could take on the British military and win? Did they really think they had a chance to take on this most powerful military in the world? We had no navy, very little arms. We were country farmers. They were insane. Or were they? I want to tell you two stories from their history. And one of the comment, John Adams said the revolution had been going on in the minds of Americans for 10 years before 1776. They didn't step onto the pages of history and take this challenge on completely out of the gate with no knowledge of where they were coming from. They had studied history. They had studied governments of the past. They were reading Locke and Blackstone and Montesquieu, and they knew about natural law and natural rights. They knew the hard-fought battles that had come through Britain that had secured rights for people, and they had come to this nation, their very forebears had come to this nation in search of religious freedom and the freedom to be able to control and decide their own futures and their own lives. And so when Britain began to exert its forces, these men were prepared. Although, in my talk earlier this morning, we can't go into it, but I have some quotes from John Adams about how unprepared they felt. He said, we don't feel prepared. We don't have what we need. We don't have an in-cleaning of what we're taking on. And then he said that at the Continental Congress. But yet they went forward and they succeeded. Because they accessed a power we need to access today. So I'm going to tell you these two stories. The settlement of the Massachusetts Bay Colony was the result of King Charles I exerting a powerful and new, as he became king after his father, he decided he wanted to consolidate all the religions of Britain back under one umbrella again and to have more control than his father was able to have. And his wife, Maria from France, he married, was a devout Catholic. And when he married her, he said that their children would be raised as Catholics. Let me try to... I'm out of time. Have we got 10 minutes?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, the time
The
goes.
citizens have spoken.
Yes. We the people demand it.
All right. When they began to settle this colony, because Charles, and I better jump ahead, there's just too much to tell. Charles exerted this powerful force and crackdown on all the other religions, and he began to try to move the ideas of Catholicism, which Henry VIII had thrown out for a lot of wrong reasons. But yet there were benefits to Henry VIII and what he did, because it opened up religious liberty to a lot of groups that were being squelched and not able to have an influence. Charles I began to try to bring Catholicism back in, and Bishop William Laud was assisting him in getting this done. The Puritans were being cracked down on, and the Puritans believed the Church of England could be fixed, it could be purified. That's why they were called the Puritans. They wanted to purify that church. They wanted to eliminate things that they thought man had stuck into the faith. They wanted to come back to the purity of the Scriptures, and they wanted to return to a purer form. That's why the Puritans. The Separatists didn't believe that the church could be salvaged. They believed it was too far gone, it was too corrupt. We needed to wipe the slate clean, we needed to start over again, so they separated from the church. So they were called the Separatists. So the Pilgrim Fathers who came were Separatists. They were completely separating. The Puritans were trying to fix the church, but now the king made it clear, I don't want your advice, I don't want you in here, I don't want to even hear from you, shut up, sit down, I know what ought to be done, listen to me. So the Puritans said, we need to do something, or we're going to be in trouble. And they looked at what the Separatists had done 10 years earlier in 1620, and they said, maybe we could go to America too. So they began talking amongst different communities and making out a plan. They knew if the king knew they were going, he'd never give permission to do it. So they had to make it look like a financial venture, and they were coming over here to start a colony for financial reasons, economic reasons. So the king gave them the charter, and they came over, and they founded the colony. And they struggled just like the separatist Pilgrim Fathers had 10 years before them. They went through all these difficulties, and after several years, they got the colony going. And then a landowner named Sir Fernando Georges, and I don't know if I'm saying that name right, but Sir Fernando Georges had held previous title to the areas of where the state of Maine is today, above Massachusetts, and part of the Massachusetts area. And he was a royalist. He was on Charles' side, and when he found out that they'd turned this into a Puritan colony, and the Puritans were running a government over here based on Puritan principles, he alarmed the king, got the king on his side, and his real idea wasn't that he was so concerned over the church, but his real idea was he was an aristocrat who wanted to have a lot of power and control, and he wanted to come over here to America and turn a colony where he could rule the colony and run it the way he wanted, become the royal governor over the colony. So he went to Charles and said, they've turned this into a Puritan colony, they're speaking against you, this is going to be a disaster for us. Let's change the charter, let me go over there, and I'll be under your influence and your power, I'll do what you want, but you let me be in charge of those guys. So the king said, okay. So he made plans to revoke the charter, wrote up a new charter, and wind of this got over here to America, and the Puritans heard about what was happening and what was coming. What did they do? Accountability, adaptability. They had a choice. They prayed. They turned to God. They fell on their knees. They prayed and they said, God, we have tried to seek your will. We've tried to come here. We've tried to do what we believe you want us to do. We are under threat. We need your help. We need to access your blessings. So they prayed, and they prepared military fortifications to try, if they had to save their colony and save what they had done. They wanted to try to stand against this Sir Fernando Georges, who was coming in to take over. So he had a new ship built and got it ready to go for the maiden voyage, and the king gave him 1,000 soldiers to come over here and install him as the new governor over Massachusetts. And at the christening voyage, as they set out into the ocean, the ship fell apart. And his second in command, who was helping him carry this out, James Mason, something close to that might be it, he mysteriously died. Well, that wasn't necessarily the end of the threat for the Puritans. So there still was this threat. This guy was still there, and he may muster this and get this whole act going again. And then all of a sudden, a very interesting thing happened. Not only had King Charles ticked off the Puritans and caused a lot of them to leave and come to America, but he ticked off some other religious groups too. And he also was trying to rule without Parliament, and he was trying to kick Parliament out and stop them. And he basically, what's the term, recessed them indefinitely. And so they were mad at him. And finally, a huge group of the people rose up against Charles I and challenged him as king, and a huge war broke out in England, and the English Civil War happened. That was really inconvenient for Sir Fernando Georges and his plans, and for King Charles's plans. And in the end, after several years of fighting, the royalists and the king lost, and a new leader was installed, Oliver Cromwell, who refused to be king and decided to rule as the protector of England and try to work these difficulties out and allow more religious freedom. So Fernando George's plans just really didn't end up working out. The Puritans' prayers were answered, and the colony was preserved, and they didn't lose their charter, and they went on to exist. After the war was done, finally Cromwell lost his seat of power. He died mysteriously. I wonder how that happened. And the royalists ended up getting back into power, and they brought Charles' son back in as the new king. And so some unpleasant things happened. But he was an old man by then, so that opportunity was lost. But the people of Boston, Massachusetts Bay Area, didn't forget God's intervention in their behalf. And these stories were passed on to their children. All right, I'm going to tell you one more story. The French Challenge of 1746. America was at war with the French. They had come over here and were also trying to claim territory in the Americas. And on the other side of the Appalachian Range, they were coming down from Canada, and they were beginning to claim all the territories around the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. And Britain wasn't very very happy about that. And they believed they had rights to a bunch of those territories, so they sent George Washington as a young 21-year-old man to tell the French, sorry, we aren't going to relinquish that property to you and honor that claim. We contest you being here. So some niceties went on, and out of that grew the French and Indian War, which was the story that Nick just shared about how Washington as a young man went in and should have been killed in that conflict, and in a miraculous turn of events, his life was spared. Had bullet holes all over his clothing, but he came out of that as the bulletproof George Washington. Another man who wouldn't compromise, another man who wouldn't adapt, another man who believed he was accountable to something if he wouldn't give in. Anyway, the French were coming, and before the English had really gotten established, they managed to take hold, the British had taken hold of a French fortification on Cape Breton Island, which is just off of the Canadian coastline. Most of you probably know where that is. And so the French arranged a whole armada of ships to be sent to America, and they were to go take back their settlement there on Cape Breton Island, and then they were to proceed to the south, and they were to lay waste to all of the colonies along the coastline. They would have had no trouble doing this because, once again, we're talking about farmers here with some guns and with a few English troops, but the English weren't aware this was going to take place. But once again, word reaches the Americas. Ahead of this group that they're coming, they're on their way, word leaks out. The Bostonians are the first community after they leave that they're going to go to Boston and lay the town in ashes. So the Bostonians call a day, the governor of the colony calls a day of fasting and prayer, to fast that God will intervene in their behalf and that this huge French armada will not be allowed to come and destroy them and their civilization. They can't take this on. The power's too big. So they pray. I want to reach the prayer. It was a clear, calm morning. The sun was shining when the minister, let me find his name up here.
Thomas Prince.
Thank you. There it is, Thomas Prince. Got the man who knows his history out here. When Thomas Prince climbed to the top of the high pulpit before hundreds of his assembled parishioners, he began to offer prayer. The sun was shining, clear, calm morning. His words: deliver us from our enemies. Send thy tempest, Lord, upon the water to the eastward. Raise, let me get a finger on here, I'm losing place. Deliver us from our enemy. Send thy tempest, Lord, upon the waters to the eastward. Raise thy right hand. Scatter the ships of our tormentors and drive them hence. Sink their proud frigates beneath the power of thy winds. Shortly after he delivered these words, the sun had disappeared behind a dark and cloudy sky, and the winds began to blow hard across the bay and beat upon the windows in the church, finally rocking and ringing the heavy bell in the steeple. We hear thy voice, O Lord, we hear it. Thy breath is upon the waters to the eastward, even upon the deep. Thy bell tolls for the death of our enemies. He bowed his head, and when he looked up again, tears were streaming down his cheeks. Thine be the glory, Lord. Amen and amen. A week later, news reached Boston that the commander, D'Anville, was dead, his armada destroyed by the storms at sea. It was reported that he had poisoned himself from the distress of his sick and dying men. Many came down with scurvy and typhus fever. 2,000 were already buried. 4,000 were sick. Less than 1,000 remained on their feet. His second-in-command committed suicide by running himself through with his own sword. I want to read another part of the Republican platform. The 2012 platform, the extended version. Today, the American dream is at risk. Our nation faces unprecedented uncertainty with great financial challenges, and under the current administration has suffered through the longest and most severe economic downturn since the Great Depression. Now, this is the part I really want you to focus on. The times call for trustworthy leadership and honest talk about the challenges we face. Our nation and our people cannot afford the status quo. And I want you to particularly pay attention to this comment. Providence has placed us at the fork in the road. Do we believe that? Does the Republican Party believe that? Providence has placed us here at this juncture in the road. Does the Republican Party believe we don't want the status quo? You answer that question. I believe many in the Republican Party believe that. I believe there are some who do not. I believe if we save this nation, we don't do it with the status quo. It's in their own platform. It's there. They've got it right, but will they live up to the platform? If you don't see that they do, I believe they will not. Because the temptation to adapt is so great. Because to resist the ability to adapt, you have to have so much faith and strength and belief that there is something greater than we are and what we can become. You have to believe, I can take the risk, I will go out on a limb, I will risk everything. Because I believe there's something greater than survival. The founders didn't want to survive. They could have survived. They could have existed. But they didn't want to live that kind of a life. So they didn't adapt. They refused to adapt. The Puritans and the Pilgrims refused to adapt. If we as today as Americans are going to adapt, I can already foretell your future. And if you look at history, you'll know where you will end up, and you'll know what your lives will be and the lives of your children. I'm afraid to say our federal government is not being accountable. It is not being responsible. It is adapting rapidly to something new. And the only way it can be stopped is if the people themselves become educated, build a frame of reference. There's no more time to wait. We have to come together, we have to unite, and we need to have educational facilities in our communities that teach these principles because they're not going to get them anywhere else. And if you don't learn it, and if you don't teach it, then it's over. We're in that dire circumstances. Now there is hope. There is hope. I don't care what scenario we face. There's nothing as ugly as the Revolutionary War and the miseries they went through. They almost lost that fight again and again. They were in horrific circumstances. And in the past, in history, we see it doesn't matter what challenges we face. It matters that we don't adapt and that we stand for something. And we call upon divine providence and we ask it to intervene in our behalf. And I promise you that it will. And I promise you this nation on some level will survive and will exist and will go into the future. And the future can be bright. And whether it's Provo by itself that does it, or it's Salt Lake, or it's the state of Utah, or it's the Mountain West, America can go on and have a future, even if the federal government can't be turned around. But let's hope it can. Let's go forward as if it can. But we need to start here at home, and we need to begin to believe these things, and we need to be sure that we are living these principles, and we need to become educated at home, because if we don't, there will not be a second chance, and you don't get freedom back once you've lost it. It takes generations to get it back. I appreciate the chance to share these ideas with you today, and I appreciate the quality of men I have had the privilege of standing with here, and the prayer, and the excellent history, and Nick for his understanding of many things that have changed in this nation, and many answers we could be accessing, and much understanding we could be gaining, and much hope, and a much brighter future we can get if we can look at how they went through this. And I ask we take the Founding Fathers as a template as we move forward. That's what I'm doing. I'm going to follow what they did. Committees of correspondence in all of our communities, linking together Paul Revere's, people, modern day Paul Revere's, who go from community to community, and so that all the little links of patriots can begin to prepare and teach and educate and get ready to take on these horrific challenges that are waiting around the corner. That's the message of hope. I thank you for this opportunity, and I I say these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
All right, well, this didn't exactly turn out the way that I had envisioned, but I think this has been very good. We've not listened to politicians, people who are afraid, of what they have to weigh and measure each word. We have listened to citizens. And we, the citizens, I have this little thing here because I have a hard time with words. This is my core belief, okay? We, the people, under God. Those are from our founding documents, aren't they? This is what will save us. And I think we've heard that message. We have we do have our platform. It's a wonderful platform. It was made by men and women, but it is a wonderful platform. And we have been challenged tonight here. We've probably heard things that we wonder about. On our tables are people with ideas that we might not understand, we might not know about. But what have we been encouraged to do tonight? I have been encouraged to study more. That's what we need to do. I really appreciate everyone who has come, and about this comments. These are our goals that we have. We wanted to teach about America's beginnings, our founding documents, and principles of self-government found therein in the UCRP platform. Have we done that? Okay. How about this? Providing direct, I'm going to skip that. Introducing various citizens and citizen groups who are actively involved in citizen duties and anxious to welcome you. Have we done that? If you have not yet done it, you still have a little time to go around and see other people are doing. And then filming our program. We did that. What we're going to do is put that on the internet so that, or more portions of it, maybe, whatever I can get past the Republican Party, because this is Republican Party presentation today.